we now call bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression. And the evidence suggests that what we used to think of as manic depression was a rare condition that probably occurred in less than 1 in 1,000 people. Now, manic depression is when people have manic episodes, when they become very over-aroused, they don't sleep at all, they do crazy things, they're very overactive, and it goes on for at least weeks and often months. And these people usually end up in hospital because it's very dramatic, it's obvious there's something wrong, they're behaving completely differently from usual, and it's sustained over quite a long period. So that is what manic depression is. It then started to be called bipolar disorder, and then ideas started to be put about that maybe there were other forms of bipolar disorder that were less dramatic. So this idea was raised that maybe there was a bipolar 2 disorder, where people had sort of sub-clinical or more minor manic episodes than people who had the more classical form that was then referred to as bipolar 1 disorder. And this allowed the idea of bipolar disorder to be applied to more and more people. And then someone came up with the idea that there was a bipolar spectrum, so that there were also people who had a sort of bipolar type personality. And really that's led to a situation where what bipolar disorder consists of is very confused. The general public probably have a completely different understanding of bipolar disorder than is in the psychiatric textbooks, which is still mainly based on the classical bipolar disorder that used to be called manic depression. But as I say, people in the general public have now come to see bipolar disorder as having sort of mood fluctuations, extreme mood fluctuations. Well, obviously, a lot of us from time to time have extreme fluctuations of mood. We might be more productive one day than we are another day. And so if you have this sort of looser concept of bipolar disorder, it's easy to persuade a lot of people that they have it. Now, the drug companies realised this in the 1990s, that this idea of mood instability was something that could expand their market for their drugs enormously. And so a number of companies that have produced antipsychotic drugs have started marketing them specifically to people with bipolar disorder. And part of their marketing campaigns have been to persuade people to consider themselves as having bipolar disorder. So there are now lots and lots of bipolar screening tests that you can get on drug company funded websites, which ask you whether you have extreme fluctuations of mood, whether you're more productive one day than you are another day, whether you veer from being very self-confident one day to feeling very underconfident another day. These screening questionnaires are full of questions that we could all say yes to at one time or another in our lives, and therefore they enable a hugely increased number of people to come under the umbrella of bipolar disorder. So what some of the drug companies that produce antipsychotic drugs have done is they've done tests of their antipsychotics in people with bipolar 1 disorder, either for an episode of acute mania or as an ongoing treatment to prevent relapse. Now, it's not surprising that a drug like an antipsychotic, it's not surprising if a drug like an antipsychotic were found to be useful in people who are acutely manic. These antipsychotics have strong sedative effects, so they're going to slow people down if people are over-aroused and overactive. And then if you continue the medication and take half of the people off and put them on placebo, you'll probably find that those people who go on to placebo get a bit speeded up again and have some reaction from coming off the medication. So those are the studies that are the basis for the marketing of antipsychotics for bipolar disorder. But the marketing, so they've been done in people with classical manic depression who are having full-blown manic episodes, but the marketing is very much targeting people who don't have that condition, who may be feeling a bit depressed, maybe on antidepressants, and the marketing is trying to persuade them to see themselves not just as depressed, but as having bipolar disorder. And I don't think that people realise, when they start thinking that they may have bipolar disorder, that the drugs they might be given have such serious consequences. And the doses of the drugs that are given for bipolar disorder are quite substantial as well. They're not the sort of small doses that you might get if you had insomnia. So people are being increasingly persuaded to consider themselves as having bipolar disorder by all the pharmaceutical marketing, and then ending up on these toxic drugs that have not been tested for people with more mild forms of bipolar disorder, and yet we know have these really serious adverse effects and complications. There was a story that's very typical written up in the Times newspaper in England by a journalist who worked for the Times, who said that he'd been having a bad patch in his life and he managed to convince himself that he had bipolar disorder. He started reading a lot of stuff on the internet. He was taking some drugs, so he was, up all night on some occasions, so he could easily tick the boxes that said that he had bipolar disorder. He went to his doctor. He said, I think I've got bipolar disorder, I've got this and this symptom. He dressed it all up a bit. So the doctor said, oh, okay, let's put you on this medication. And he said he woke up 2 years later, having been in this fog for 2 years on this medication, and realised that he had never had bipolar disorder. He had had a crisis which was quite understandable in other terms. In normal terms, he'd had a breakup, he was struggling at work, and he'd lost 2 years of his life through being on these strongly sedative substances. I am a psychiatrist. I think antipsychotic drugs can be useful if people are really psychotic, really distressed, really locked up in their own world. The fact that antipsychotics dampen down all the sort of frenetic activity that's going on can sometimes help people to rejoin the real world in that situation. But they are toxic drugs that have really serious complications, especially if you use them for long periods of time. And I think they are overprescribed. We don't give people enough opportunity to try and get off them and see if they could manage without them. And even more worrying, we are now recommending them to more and more people who would not previously have ever thought of taking these sorts of drugs, and whose problems are not the sort of problems that these drugs have been tested in. So people with depression or anxiety or this new expanded concept of bipolar disorder are all getting onto antipsychotics when antipsychotics have not been properly tested in these conditions, and yet we know that they have these really serious adverse effects. So I found out about the real truth about health conferences and the real truth about science conferences a few years ago when I was first invited to come and speak. And they're appealing because you get such an amazing range of speakers. So I just sat through a really interesting talk on the lack of any evidence base for most screening programs, the fact that people are really not informed about the adverse effects of health screening for various conditions. And I've also sat through a fascinating talk on climate change and how the science about climate change can be distorted. So I think the real truth about health conferences are fantastic for getting a wide range of highly respected speakers together who are telling a story that doesn't always get into the mainstream. I think that's what's really important. There are many people trying to do the right thing in the mainstream, but they're still being influenced very heavily by money. So as far as drugs and for mental health conditions, but also for any health conditions are concerned, the pharmaceutical industry is still very influential, and however many well-meaning doctors and health professionals there are around, they're not necessarily able to counteract that influence, and of course they come under that influence as well. So this conference is really important to help put to help balance that, to help put the other view out there.